Next panel, Leadership Through Crisis, where our panelists and speakers will expose the critical role of effective leadership and government transparency as countries attempt to navigate to contemporary geopolitical landscape. So please welcome Shaila Manyam and our esteemed panel.
Good afternoon, everybody. We're all here at the UN General Assembly, the 79th UN General Assembly, at a very interesting time in our history. We talk a lot about crisis and leadership in crisis, but I think it's very clear that what we're dealing with now is something very, very different. Call it a polycrisis. And 2024 is marking sort of the nexus of what that polycrisis looks like. Just as one example, throughout the world, 49% of the world's population is going or went to the polls this year to elect new leaders. That's approximately 4 billion people. So if elections aren't the biggest election year in our history, is it enough of a sea change? We're dealing with this amid a big backdrop of global crises coming to a head: climate, economies, violence, regional instability. How do leaders really knit all that together? How do you keep your calm, keep your center, and really kind of lead in a crisis, or in many crises, as it turns out? I'm thrilled today to be joined by 3 experts that are going to take us through this. Starting with the far right, I'd like to introduce Dr. Karthik Ramanna, who's a professor of business and public policy at the University of Oxford's Blavarnik School of Government and the co-founder of the E-Liability Institute. We're honored to be joined by General Andrew Poppas, the commanding general of United States Army's Forces Command, or FORSCOM, who's leading approximately 750,000 plus soldiers around the world and about 20,000 civilians. And finally, we're joined by Arun Gupta, who is the CEO of Noble Reach Foundation. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today. We're looking forward to learning so much from you. I'd like to start actually with Mr. Gupta. How can leaders and institutions better prepare for the next generation? And we talk about the next generation, I think, with a lot of sometimes cliches about Gen X or Gen Z. But really, when you think about it, they're the fastest growing generation in the world, particularly in lower and middle income countries. They're one of the most important voter bases to sway. They really are that next generation of leaders walking into, I think, something none of us have ever had to face at that age. How do you really prepare them for what lies ahead, the impact of what's happening now, as well as the unknowns that they're about to face?
Well, thank you for the question, and thank you for having me here today. I mean, I think when we think about inspiring this next generation of leaders, we think about really needing an entrepreneurial mindset, and that means in a world that's changing so rapidly, technologically, geopolitically, socially, environmentally, you can't just plan and come up with a 5-year plan and teach them how to do that. What you need to be teaching them is the skills to be able to test and learn quickly and experiment very quickly. And that's an important muscle, because with that also is you're not going to get everything right. And we need to be teaching them that's okay. And creating that muscle with this next generation that's going to be imperative as we try to solve these big problems. I think the second element to this is more interdisciplinary learning, right? More empathy across domains and understanding of that. We don't have enough of that today. You know, what we try to do at Noble Reach is how do we foster more dual citizens? And when we say dual citizens, we mean someone that understands the public sector and the private sector, the language, the way you talk, the people, the culture. And most importantly, what you're doing when you're doing that is you're bridging trust. You know, we have a trust deficit right now. Everyone kind of goes in and goes deep into their silo. But if we're going to solve these larger problems, it's going to require interdisciplinary connectivity, but also an entrepreneurial mindset where you're constantly testing and learning.
Oh, I think that's great. And again, you talk about trust, and I think that's such an important element of leadership in crisis. I mean, if you don't trust your leadership, you don't trust what's in front of you, that's really the most crucial element when we talk about building resilience and agility and the flexibility that leaders need to come out of this. And General Poppas, I'd love to talk with you more about that. What do you see as part of building that trust when you're leading troops in crisis? And I mean, certainly in some of the places you and I work together, we've seen just about everything that can be thrown at us. But how do you really keep that confidence going forward and make sure that you're finding that breach and leading your people through it?
Thank you, Sheila. And I did laugh as you were talking about the world in crisis, because we remember those places. We saw each other numerous times. And it is a privilege to be here, and I'm very grateful to share the stage with the experts. I also realize I'm the only one who's not written a book, so I've got some work ahead of me. But building trust is an imperative part of, especially within the military realm, and we're all here, and we're all in the profession of building leaders to deal with and successfully in crisis. But building that trust, it doesn't start at the moment of the crisis. You have to take yourself back to you're building the team and you're training the team, and you have to do that together. And part of the building the team and the trust comes, I'll tell you, the first is the baseline, bringing them in, basic training, the military academies, ROTC, and you have to bring them in, and they have to understand your values. And you have to inculcate them into the culture of your formation so they understand, the who we are and why we're doing what we're doing. And then there's also a baseline of technical competencies that you have to build, how to be proficient at your job. But then the trust comes when you have that foundation, is building the team. And that team comes from shared experiences, shared hardships. And for us, so you're going to face the dilemmas and the challenges of crisis in advance. So there's going to be a number of scenarios of life-like, for us, military situations that you're going to have to train through. And then as you go through these different scenarios, once you meet a level of success, you start changing the variables in them. So you make it more difficult. You change, if you did it in the desert, you now do it in the mountains or the jungle. If you have multivariable and change the dilemmas, so you force them not what to think, but how am I thinking myself through the problems? And then as you have these shared experiences and the shared hardships, both mental and physical, when you come through that, and I call these leadership laboratories. And as you go through those, you build confidence through each execution in each other as a team, but also in your leader. And you want to do that in these laboratories because that's a safe space, because you're going to fail. We set you up to fail so that you can fail, learn, and re-execute. And you do that not to get it right, but you can't get it wrong. And that trust that I talk about, it's up and down the chain of command. And when you've proven that trust, first in your leaders, that the orders are giving you are just and understandable, but in the execution, because when you build that trust in your subordinate leaders, that allows them to have very decentralized execution, intent-based orders that they can move to execute the goal without your direct supervision. That provides that operational flexibility and trust and confidence in a formation.
I love that you frankly talk about it in terms of skill development, because in a lot of ways it really is. It is, I think, that muscle memory that you get at, Mr. Gupta, when you talk about Venture Mission in your book. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about how skill development, how that sort of really important part of training, muscle memory, whatever we want to call it, might play into building this sort of more trustful foundation?
Well, I think, to the General's comment, you need to be putting people in positions in sandboxes where they can test and learn. And they have to also know that the folks that they're reporting to aren't going to penalize them for failing. Because if you do create a risk structure where every time you make a mistake, you're going to be penalized, what you're going to do is quickly create an organization that's going to be playing not to lose. And there's a big difference, for not using sports analogies, but there's a big difference in mindset when you're playing to win versus playing not to lose. And if you're playing to win, you have to empower your subordinates, your team, your colleagues, up and down the chain to be able to make mistakes. And the key part is, so I was a venture capitalist before starting the foundation. And we would start board meetings with, what are the 5 mistakes we made last quarter? It's a really empowering thing. Because if people say there's no mistakes, then the question would be like, well, why aren't we innovating fast enough? Because we can't be doing everything right. But it also enabled folks to be able to say, it's okay to be making mistakes. Mm-hmm. Now, the question is, if it showed up quarter after quarter the same mistake, that's a problem. Because we're not learning. And so that's how we balance
firms in.
Yes, exactly right.
No, that's great. I'd love to kind of touch a little bit on what you're saying about this whole idea of winning and losing, because really when you talk about where we are in terms of not just crises, but the polarization that can make crises worse, that can make your reaction to them much worse, much more segmented, much more inconsistent. Some of that I kind of wonder, Dr. Ramanna, does that come from this idea of where people feel like we're living in a zero-sum world? And I think, how do we take what Mr. Gupta and what General Poppas are talking about and really think about this as skill development and maybe correct some of that polarization?
Yeah. So two critical themes that have come out in the remarks so far. One, that you want to be prepared for this moment. And the first time you're dealing with it shouldn't be in the midst of the crisis, and you should be starting well before that. And for the purposes of the project that we worked on which we call the Age of Outrage, How to Lead in a Polarized World, we worked with dozens of leaders, everyone from the Commissioner of the London Metropolitan Police, who was dealing with protests around race and policing, to a woman who was running the Peace Commission in the central Nigerian state of Kaduna, which deals with routine violence, to the mayor of a town in between the border of Venezuela and Brazil, who had been overwhelmed by migrants from Venezuela. So with each of these public leaders, we were trying to understand, what were some of the themes of things that worked well and what worked less well. And through and through, it was the leaders who anticipated the problem. What we call the Age of Outrage suggests that you can't just be in crisis management mode, because if it is an age of outrage, then, and if you were simply handling this as crisis management, you would very quickly be exhausted, because there's no way you can sort of constantly be in firefighting mode. So you have to prepare the organization for this moment, and you have to start early on. And that's what each of the leaders who did this successfully did, was to what the general said: start early on, build a capacity within the team to fail, and to experience victories together. Because what happens, for instance, in the context of the London Metropolitan Police, they were dealing with very sort of divisive protests around race and policing in the midst of the COVID pandemic. And you're bringing together people from very different lived experiences to sort of de-escalate the situation. And the group there had no shared experience of victory. They had no shared experience of each other apart from crises. And so it was very hard for that group to make any progress in that moment. So then saying, okay, well, this is not the last time we're going to have this problem, so let's use this as an opportunity to be ready for that next moment is what leaders have done quite well.
But how do you do that? And I'm kind of looking at General Poppas, but really anyone chime in. How do you do that when victory really means something different to different populations or different people? Like, how do you really create that sense of shared experience when we were in Iraq, for example, and again, it's not just a unilateral population, it's so many different people who are defining victory and success so differently?
Well, I think it's a great point. You have to look at it at echelon. What is success? And as leaders at echelon, obviously the military has multiple echelons, from the smallest of 11 people up to 700,000. How do you articulate those goals, and how do you articulate what success is at the echelon? And building the team, we keep going back to that. It goes back to the shared experiences. It's building trust in one another, the shared successes, the shared failures. And each time this educational base has to increase. You move to different jobs. The training that I had as a young lieutenant in charge of 34 and the threats that we faced as a platoon leader in combat were much different than I faced on the joint staff. We're very strategic engagements. And then how do you communicate? And we have a responsibility to communicate with direct candor to those issues of national security that have military implications. And I think that's how you build trust. And one other part, when I talk about the strategic level of engagement, and there's those that have to engage with, and we are fiercely protective of the civil military and our leadership of the elected officials. But you still have to speak with candor. Not always the message that wants to be heard, but you also have to do that in confidence. There are no leaks, because you have to have trust built, or you'll be excluded from the room. And if you are, then you're not doing your full duty, the full diligence, in order to make sure that it is the most informed decision that our senior leaders are going to make. And that's our responsibility.
Let me just pick up on that. Because the last 8 years, we've built a program for 1,000 public leaders from 150 countries around the world, and at the University of Oxford. And the one rule we have is no social media when you're in that program. Because of course the temptation is there to play to the outside, to play to your stakeholder base. And so there's literally, it doesn't matter if you're a cabinet minister or a head of state, you leave your phone at the door and you come in and you sit in that room. Because if you've got social media there, it destroys the trust, right?
Yeah.
Right?
Unforgivable.
Yeah.
Unforgivable.
Yep.
No, it really does. I know we're kind of coming up a little bit, unfortunately, on what frankly could be a conversation all day. But I'd love to ask kind of a wrap-up question here. Again, we're at the UN General Assembly. There are leaders from 170 plus countries here. This is maybe our one chance to sort of say, what do you see as the leadership lesson that they need to be conveying or that they need to keep in mind? And maybe Mr. Gupta, we can start with you.
Look, I think first, my lens is I was a VC and then I was teaching on a college campus. And so the commonality and thread in that is optimism.
Yeah.
And I just fundamentally believe optimism needs to be part of leadership. And you don't lead by fear. You have to lead with optimism. So that would be point one, I would say to the folks that are in town this week. The second then, once you lay out that optimistic view of where you want to go, building that trust is essential, and we've just heard that with your team from the ground up. But doing that cross functions, cross society, cross viewpoints is essential. Not building trust just within those that are in your tribe per se or on your team, but building trust and understanding, and that's where I think the dual citizens become incredibly important. These are the folks, these are the fabrics, these are the glue people on a basketball team. They don't show up in the big numbers, but they're the ones that are able to bridge and get things done. And so I think cultivating that in our young leaders is incredibly important.
Absolutely. General?
I would fully agree, and I think optimism is contagious. And we need that in our world leaders today, and we need that in our national leadership with a bright vision for the future. Also empathy. You have to have empathy as a leader to have an understanding for those that you lead and the challenges that they're facing. And the last piece I think that you have to have, this goes back to the national or whatever organization, if you're values-based, because that is the light that is going to bring people together and provide the path that people want to follow. And if you are a values-based organization and you're a values-based leader, you have to live that life, and that's going to set the example for all to follow.
And I will endorse the point around optimism, but just to build on that, one of the things we found that leaders have done really well in making progress on trust building is to be modest and humble about what it is they want to take on in the first, right? If you go in and say, I'm going to boil the ocean, then chances are you will disappoint everyone and lose whatever trust you started off with. But if you have narrow, well-defined set of goals, then you can deliver on that, and then that becomes the basis for the next round of commitments.
No, I think I've learned a lot from talking to the three of you. So I really want to thank Dr. Ramanna, General Poppas, Mr. Gupta for being with us today. And I maybe add to that at the end, listening is probably the most important leadership tool that we should keep in mind. Listening to your different constituents, listening to the people that you're trying to help or that you think you're trying to help. And maybe I think keeping that sense of optimism, keeping our ears open, and keep being clear about our goals, we can really kind of find that path forward. Thank you all for being with us today. We're so grateful for your leadership, for your experience, and frankly for the skill development you're doing with the next generation.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Humility.